hold you when I see your light. Dark star.
I'm Hal Scarab, Vice President of the York Sundry Historical Society, and I want to welcome all of you to this presentation we're doing that is designed to honor Stanton Friedman. It's our third presentation in the series, and this time we've got Chris Stiles with us. He's going to be speaking tonight on his longtime friend and colleague, Stanton Friedman, with whom he forged a professional relationship through his work on the Shag Harbour Incident. Author of the book Impact to Contact, the Shag Harbour Incident, he's appeared in and served as a paid consultant in several feature UFO documentaries produced in both the US and Canada. In 1995, he directed an underwater search for the physical evidence of the UFO crash that may have remained on the seabed of Shag Harbour. Chris has presented at various international UFO symposia. He has a blended view of the UFO phenomena. He combines an essential nuts and bolts reality with a powerful psychological psychic component. And this includes the possibility of reality transformations via controlled witness perception. Now, I'll get him to explain that to you himself. But rather than beat it to death, ladies and gentlemen, Chris Stiles. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Harold. Well, I'm going to start this presentation by talking about the phenomena of Stanton Friedman. For me, my first awareness that there was a Stanton Friedman came in April of 1992. And I was at a very close friend's house, who, by the way, now lives in Fredericton, although at the time was in Metro Halifax. And I watched a rerun of Unsolved Mysteries. And this was the episode that had a segment that did with the Roswell incident. It was the first I heard of the Roswell incident, and it was the first I'd heard of Stanton Friedman, who was a consultant and on-camera personality within the show. Well, I watched it quite intently, as did my friend. And when the show was over, this friend looked at me and said, "Do you think that such a thing's possible, that a flying saucer could crash in the desert of New Mexico?" And my response was, "I'm certain that it's possible because it happened here. Not in the desert, in this case, in the water." And I recounted my dim and vague recollection of the Shag Harbour incident. I couldn't remember the exact date. I suspected it was in our centennial year, 1967, a marvelous and crazy year here in Canada. And for the UFO phenomena too, worldwide, it was what they used to call a flap year in the golden days. Lots of sightings, lots of encounters, lots of things going on. So after I recounted that, this friend encouraged me and said, "Do you know the fellow that was on there, the nuclear physicist? He lives in Fredericton." I was surprised to hear that because, it was quite clear that he was an American citizen. And I thought, really? And the friend suggested that I should give Stanton a call. And I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." And this good friend said, "No, I know you won't. You'll put it off. You're a procrastinator, and at some point it just won't happen." She shoved the phone and put it on my lap and said, "There, call the long distance operator." So rather than wait for the double dog dare, I took the phone, picked it up, called the long distance operator and asked. I was surprised. I thought, well, this isn't going to happen. Somebody like that would not have a listed number, but Stanton Friedman did have a listed number, and the operator gave it to me. So I dialed that number, and instantly it was answered, but by a human answering service. And they told me that Stanton was not at home, that he was away, but there was an emergency number if it was something really important. And for some reason, I said, "Yeah, I'll take that number, please." And they gave it to me. I had no idea where I was dialing. This was in the bad old days in 92, here in Nova Scotia, and probably in most places, when there were no calling plans. I dialed the number, and it was a number in Austin, Texas, for a motel. And Stanton picked up the phone. He was about to leave to go to a MUFON conference. He took the phone, and I was completely unprepared and didn't know what to say. So I identified myself and started to say, "Look, I started to tell him my recollections of the Shag Harbour Incident and asked if he had heard of it. And he was like, Shag Harbour, no, no. And the more I recounted, he was, I think, assessing me and figuring there's enough detail here, though I didn't know the hard facts like date or whatever, that, it had, I suppose, what you would call simply the ring of truth to it. So he gave me the time of day, and that initial conversation lasted about 20 minutes. And I never forgot it, because when it was done, he said, if you want to put the effort into this, he says, I think you're going to be lucky. He says, and it's going to be a lot easier than what I've had to cope with in Roswell. And he said, simply because fishermen don't move. A really simple thing, these kind of basic. And I thought, yes. And he said, you need to find that date. So you go back. He says, I don't remember this one. It might be in a book. And I added a few additional details. And one of them that was after the impact, I said, this thing left a long streak of yellow foam in the harbor that was about half a mile long. And that seemed to trigger a faint memory in Stanton. And he said, you know something? He said, now that you say that fact, he says, I remember people approaching me when I spoke in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. And they came up and asked if I knew a case that happened on, and they weren't sure if it was Pubnick over Shag Harbour or where it was back in the 60s, where there had been an impact. And, the yellow foam seemed to trigger something in the memory. So anyway, he promised to ask around about it. And he said he would write me a letter when he got home and try to give me some other suggestions when he had time. He says, I really got to run. I'm expected at a conference. True to his promise, I received a snail mail, well-typed letter on his personal stationery a few days later that made some suggestions. And I had already gone out and done some research in the Halifax Regional Library, had come up with the date. I started flipping through a book that did have a brief section in it by John Robert Columbo, and it had a date, but there was very little information on the case. Anyway, with that, of course, I was able to go to provincial archives, get old newspaper clippings and that. But already Stanton had sent me an application to seek funding from the Fund for UFO Research. And I thought, okay, well, I better get some more background and details if I'm going to do this, because it was a pretty detailed application. And I thought, gee, am I ready for this? And what would I do with the funding and that? I also remembered that I had, a friend in high school, and his dad had trained the Granby divers, but we'll save that story for when I get into Shag Harbour. Anyway, the next thing you know, Stanton was getting more involved with offering me help and going on. And I was just dying to meet him. And the first chance I had to meet Stanton, I'll never forget, was in the Agricultural College in Toronto, Nova Scotia. And once I heard that, I filled up my car with friends and we drove down. And it was a good thing that I filled my car with friends, because unfortunately, all like too many UFO events that are poorly advertised. And we got there. We went in, and I think there was about 10 people in the room, and I brought 6 more in my car. So we went down to the lecture in Toronto, and he was the only speaker, of course, and we had a break for lunch, and this went all day. And he said, I knew you would come, he said, so I got something for you. And he brought a box of documents from his house, from the famous basement. And he handed it to me. He says, give it back to me when you see me sometime. He says, I'm sure we'll be seeing one another. So I, thanked him so much and took the thing. It was a fascinating day at the lecture to see him up close and personal in that small audience in the lecture hall at the Agricultural College. When it was over, the small group all wanted to hang together for some more Q&A and meet and greet, and we all agreed to go to a nearby Tim Hortons. We met there, and I believe we were in Bible Hill, and everything was good. There was a few customers in the store, not many. We were in a big huddle. Everybody made a purchase, and the discussions were lively. It was a very heady time that day, and I was making the most of it. We had a couple warnings from the assistant manager, a young blonde girl who worked there, I can remember, who come over and said, you guys need to keep the language down. The language there was nothing improper, But she says, I'm not sure everybody else wants to hear about this topic. And it seemed to personally bother the assistant manager quite a bit. Anyway, the conversation continued. There were several more warnings. And at some point, we were about to part, and we all reached in the pocket and were exchanging business cards. Well, that was it. She come over and said, that's it. You all got to get out, get out. She goes, you just can't be exchanging business cards here in the store. Something I never encountered before, and apparently neither did Stanton, and he just kind of like grinned and sheesh, and stood up at the rest of us. Some of the younger audience participants were very incensed by this and tried to tell this girl, do you know who he is, and that he was worthy of more respect. And Stanton says, I think we're all worthy of a little more respect. He says, but no, we should go. He says, I have to depart anyway and head home in his Toyota. Well, we went to go. One or two of the fellas got a little mouthy. Again, it was all up. They were just expressing opinion, nothing vulgar, and they left. She went right over and called the police, and we were outside and just departing when they came up. No one was arrested. Stanton went over and spoke on the behalf and tried to explain the situation the best he could. And he said, well, all I know is you guys got to go. And we went our ways, but it was a shakeup. He said, this is nothing to what you can run into in the field. He said, Chris, you stay with this. Wait till you get the death threats and the whatever, and people pointing their finger. Yes, it happened. And there were serious death threats at an event I was at against Stanton. I once had somebody approach me in Spring Garden Road in Halifax with a knife because I did the work of the devil. These things happen. It's unfortunate. How this comes into it, in some cases, it's simply psychosis. In some cases, jealous colleagues that take it way too far. In other cases, I don't know, bad brains. I can't explain it. Anyway, Stanton took it all in stride. He wasn't offended. We left. But I remember one of the guys went back in and hollered at her. He said, dear, he says, I think this is why your daddy fought in the war, so that we could exchange cards and we could talk about whatever we liked in this country of freedom. But anyway, that was my first time I met Stanton, and there would be many other things like that were so just memorable with him. When I heard Kathleen speak of him and many others, about many people put it as, when they have a line to put in a brochure about him or something, the gregarious physicist. You hear this all the time. Well, he was that, and he was all these things. And as Kathleen said, the perfect gentleman. But my introduction to him was kind of like, I saw this man who put up with so much. People call him reporting sightings at 4 a.m., a listed phone number, which I'm sure even by his time was, quite unusual. And, he just took it all in stride, right? The other thing was that early on, when I made my first trips to the States and started getting lectures booked in various places, MUFON conferences, Boston, I was everywhere from, Florida to California. One of the things I quickly became aware of was that Stanton had a great reputation amongst his followers that I considered, I already knew was myth, and in many cases unfounded. Many of them feared him. And part of this crew wrote of his excellent debating skills. And they talked about, he was on the stage with so-and-so and he ripped them to shreds, and he tore them down and he won this thing. And somebody said, what you knew about this case, when you hear all these stories, why don't you go, oh, no, I'm not going near him. He's great, but he's like a bear. They were scared to speak to him and approach him and that, And after a greater time, after I'd been on television with him on a few shows and national TV and that, and I'd go down to the US for a conference, I was starting to hear whispers and these little legends saying, he's been on television with Stanton and he had disagreed with him on TV. And people would go, oh my God, what did Friedman do? What did he say? And they go, nothing. Well, this is all kind of overblown. And, Stanton and I often did disagree. We certainly agreed on most things. But, there was such a legend around him that there was this, and of course, like I said, all the former descriptions we'd heard here in previous presentations here were all true. Stanton was a teddy bear. He was great, right? He could express himself. He had his humor, he had his wit. He wasn't shy to say exactly what he meant. He wasn't an apologist, as he said. Sometimes that I feared, geez, one of these days I'm going to stray too far that way, because we didn't agree on everything. But I used to find it funny, and it was very hard. There's a couple times I actually tried to suppress these stories and rumors. But then again, I saw the ugly side. Like I say, I've seen people, who unfortunately had personal problems that would threaten Stanton and other people in the field. I remember once being at a MUFON conference, and there were serious threats that had to be dealt with, and police called for threats against Stanton and Walt Andrus and John Schuessler, people who were, in the field and well regarded, and certainly undeserving of these kind of things. But it's something you come to deal with, when you're in this. And it troubled me a great deal. And eventually I ran into a little bit of it here and there, but Stanton had me prepared for that. And he was like, well, some people's children, he used to say, and he'd shake his head, and he just took it all in stride. But, I learned so much from him, and it was that sage, simple advice. Like I said, when he said, well, fishermen don't move, but he would say these things every time before we'd go on television. He'd lean over to me just before we'd make our entrance, and he'd say, Chris, don't forget to sizzle. You got to sizzle. I used to like that one. I was, okay, we'll sizzle. It was so funny. I think the first time actually I met him was in Toronto, and he got a real kick because I can remember when we flew up there, I wrote down on my boarding pass. Remember, this is before 9/11. Things were very loose security in the airport. I put down first flighter on the thing. Now, I wasn't a seasoned traveler like him, but I wasn't the first time. And he says, what are you putting that on for? And I handed it in. And the next thing, I go, whoa, whoa, whoa. This, flight attendant grabs me and says, you're getting the tour, as they used to do in those days, takes me up to the cockpit. Well, I was up there. I got the tour. I got to meet the pilot and whatever. And of course, I had to play the role. So I told them, well, no, I've never flown. I just never had a reason. I'm 40, whatever I was back then. And they gave me the tour, talked about the plane. We're trying to calm my nerves, which, were okay. Introduced me to somebody in the jump seat. I can remember that time with Stanton when he was up to what I was doing. The person in the jump seat turned out to be the defense minister for Ireland. And, I met him, nice gentleman. When I went back to see, Stanton says, so what did you learn up there that you didn't know before? I often picked up UFO stories up there from the pilots, the kind which I really used to like to seek out in that. I didn't on this day, but I told him about the guy up in the jump seat. He's like, oh, that's not very good. Gets worse than that, though. He says, wait till you get in that little itty bitty plane and you have to spiral into a landing strip in South America. And he had the stories, but, he had traveled to every state and around the world. And I guess Antarctica would probably be the only one he had missed, but those stories were something. And the whole, it was just great. Another great memory I have, Stanton, and to see him sitting beside me and slightly irritated. We were both invited once in Halifax to a premiere of a documentary we both appeared in. A 2-hour documentary was produced by Ocean Entertainment in Halifax, and it was called Northern Lights. I think Chris Rakowski was part of that, and many other people across Canada, science fiction writer Spider Robinson, many others. And when we did that show, and it actually had a premiere during Nova Scotia Film Week in Halifax, the Oxford Theatre there in Halifax and Quimple Road was the only large single venue theatre left, and still is, I believe. And during this week, that documentary, and I think one by Paul Kimball that was about hockey or something, were running on a double bill, and they were up on the marquee, and they drove us up, and Stanton and myself, I think his wife Marilyn was there. And it was a bit of a to-do, and the filmmaker, Mike McDonald of Ocean Entertainment, was there. And before they ran, we had to stand at at the bottom of the theater and just sort of give, you know, a 2 to 5 minute introduction on working on the production of what you see and what he hoped it would do. And then they ran the film. Stanton was sitting right beside me in the theater. And he said, "Have you seen the final cut of this thing?" I said, "Yes, I had." "Was it okay?" I said, "Yeah, I was all right with it." I said, "There might be a few mistakes." And when you got to the portion of the doc that was about Roswell, I can remember they said, "and Farmer Mac Brazel." And you could hear Stanton above everybody in the theater go, "Rancher." And anytime there was some little thing, this booming voice would come out and correct it over, and everybody would giggle in the audience. And it was just a great moment. And these are the kind of things that I just love and remember so well about him, you know. And I'd pat him on the shoulder and go, "Hey, hey, hey, you know, you wait when we hear the mistakes." And then when they did this terrible animated rendition of this thing running out of gas over the desert and crashing, he was like, oh, I thought, man, he's going to need a back rub after this, I can remember. But he took it all in Wells Pride, and they bought him a great dinner afterwards. And he was just such a character. But I can remember that every time there was something you disagreed with, you'd hear the correction loud and clear bellow through the whole theater. And it was those moments you hang on to. And, you know, he's greatly missed. One of the other things is that, of course, he'll be really missed in Shag Harbour, because some people there realized how much he was in facilitating me and encouraging me to continue on, you know, with this case, right? And over the years, there were several times he came to Shag Harbour and presented there when they would have their little UFO festivals, as they sometimes called them, or small symposiums. He did several of them. And I'll tell you something very unique about this. It's interesting. You know, when you booked Stanton and you were in, didn't matter where, of course, you know, Stanton, you know, would demand upon, you know, the proper contract and payment that he be in a decent hotel. And there was a certain minimal standard. And it wasn't the kind of informal thing. He typically did not agree to being billeted at somebody's home if they couldn't afford the extra cost or whatever. And you had to meet him, which was, of course, all fair and proper, you know, for somebody of his stature and, you know, who travels and, you know, deserve that respect. But he made one exception that I know of, and I believe it is the only one, and that's when he used to come to Shag Harbour. First of all, there really isn't a hotel that's all that close. You know, you'd have to go 35, 40 minutes into Yarmouth or into Shelburne, at least into Barrington. There's a few options there now. There was really none then when he would come for these bookings. And but after the first time and every other time, he liked coming back and he liked staying. And he was in some fine homes there, and I stayed there with him. And they were just great times when the event would be over. There was a fisherman's home we were in, and he had a lovely place with a big high fence and a kidney-shaped swimming pool, and there was great barbecues and banter afterwards. And he just looked forward to coming down each year and being at these things as much for the, not après-ski, but the get together, you know, this element of it when it was over. And I can remember one of the last times it was down, it was so funny. And people would show up all around, you know, of course, to meet Stanton and to see him there sort of, you know, with tie off and the banter and this sort of thing. And people would give things. And I can remember one of the fellows who was known well there showed up, and he had a bunch of, I guess they were high-end cigars. And he said, "Stanton, would you like a cigar?" And he goes, "They're $10 cigars." I guess he threw that in because he thought maybe they aren't worthy of a gentleman like him, so well-traveled and that. And he said, "Oh, they don't have to be $10 for me to smoke them, but give me a couple." So he started, he lit up and he's smoking cigar. And then somebody else came with a case of good single malt scotch. And, you know, he kept pushing his glass forward to have a drink, you know, when we were sitting around. This went on through the night. And some people were suggesting to him, they go, "That stuff will sneak up on you, Stan. You might want to back off." And he kept accepting refills and that. I think it was somewhere after midnight. He stood up suddenly. We were all outside just having such a great time. And he said, "I think I should go to bed now." He goes, "If I wait any longer, I might require some assistance." I'll tell you, he'll be sorely missed down there. And I guess next year, hopefully, you know, as COVID comes under control, we're going to have a UFO expo there, and we get a lot of great talent in the field book that come from the US. But I'll tell you, he will be missed down there, and many remember his performances, and certainly before and after, and his warmth, and it just won't be the same without him, sort of thing. And I can remember I'll tell you another memory I have of that. We were there one time, and when you looked at the order of the speakers, I was supposed to be first one Saturday morning, and he was going to be last. And as what happened too many years down there, I was involved. Somebody decided they're going to shoot some local documentary with me. And it sounds funny, you don't think of Shag Harbour as being a sunspot, but it always seemed that I ended up getting sunburnt, or, they'd always stand me. And this is largely because, a lot of the footage would be shot, on boats at sea, right? And you're out in the open and you do multiple takes. And, almost all, and I was aware of this, I usually had sunscreen, but it would get left on the dock, or, you didn't have time. Well, it's just one more shoot, Chris, just one more, And I can remember one of the last times when Stanton presented, I got up in the morning and I was really sunstroke. I was in bad shape. And I remember he looked at me and said, "Are you going to be okay?" I said, "How would you like to go first?" And he had been booked last. He said, "I'd love to go first." I don't think he really wanted to, but, he did that. That's the kind of guy and the gentleman he was. So I said, "Oh, thank you." And I did everything you do when you're in that kind of shape so that I was ready at the end of the day to present, and I did. And I remember everybody stayed to the end and kept on, but, including Stanton. But, I have all those fond memories of him. And I can tell you another thing, one more great little enjoyable story about him. One of the things that's so rare now is I got a few opportunities to do true live TV with him. And that was a real hoot, and he enjoyed it immensely. We had done things. I can remember one of the first times I was with him was actually, in Toronto on the Deanie Petty show, and that's shot and presented on television as if it's live television, but it isn't. However, in Halifax, and it used to be broadcast throughout the Maritimes, there used to be a show called the Dwayne Lowe Show through Global, and we had both been on it a couple times with and without each other. And I can remember one of the times we're on together, Stan looked at me and he asked them, he says, "Is there any delay? Is this?" And the guy said, "No, this is true live TV." Wow, we said, "Cool." And he looked at me and said, "Geez, that's refreshing. I haven't done that in a long time." So the show begins and we're going, and it was going fine. We're dealing with the host and the show and clips we had prepared and dealing with issues. And toward the end, they were going to take some Q&A. Well, whenever they'd stop and go to the commercial break, the floor director would be looking at us, and he was nervous because we were having all this banter, and him and I sitting there laughing about it. He said, "My God, this is funny." He said, "I haven't done true live TV in ages." And the floor directors would be going, "Come on, guys, 5, 4, come on." And we'd be laughing and going, and they were panicking right up to the second. And then, of course, you just go into that other mode, and you picked up where you left off and did the show. And he seemed to enjoy it immensely. Well, that's all fun, and that's good fun, and you get it when you can when you're in a field like this, where, like I say, you might have to deal with everything from, Phil Class and the skeptics to whatever. But I think the greatest fun I ever seen them have on TV, I wasn't there, but they had me on the phone talking to him. And it was funny. Again, it was another episode of the Dwayne Lowe Show, and he was on there debating and arguing with an astronomer from St. Mary's. And the topic of Shag Harbour came in because of somebody coming in. Mostly they were talking about UFOs in general and Roswell. And somebody asked about Shag Harbour. And the astronomer said, "Oh, I couldn't find anything on that whatsoever." But from what I had described, I think it was just a will o' the wisp. So I called in as people were calling in, and they connected me through and put me on. And my voice was, of course, live in the studio and on the show. And I said, "I don't know why you have an astronomer like him on the show." I said, "If you do have an astronomer, which is perfectly legit, you should find someone that's agreed to do a little research or make themselves familiar with the topic before they express an opinion." Because I said, "I'm sure if you put a plumber or a man off the street, he'd have done that research, rather than be caught that way." I said, because ironically, he works in the observatory on the 32nd floor, Tower 1 at St. Mary's, and if you taken to the elevator to the first floor and gone into archives, the archivist there, I know where I would have helped them and showed them all the material there held by the late Father Michael Burke Gaffney, who built that observatory and designed the program he's in and now runs. And you would have seen one of the primary sources of documents for Shag Harbour would have all been there for him. But I said, no, it is not a will o' the wisp. And while I was expressing this opinion, the camera was panning from the astronomer to the face of Stanton, and Stanton was just leaned back in the chair with a grin from ear to ear and clapping his hands and loving this, So yeah, that was the kind of fun we had when we could, I remember that first lecture I seen. I'll wrap it up this way as the topic of Stanton goes. I like to say the phenomenon of Stanton Friedman. One of the titles he used in the documentary and often in his lectures, and that was that UFOs are real. Well, I'd like to stress that UFOs are real, and Stanton Friedman was real. And like I say, he's going to be missed, and especially at our 2022 UFO Expo next year. I would consider myself a lucky man to have known him at the level I did, to see him, out of the tie and hair down and, at his cutting best when he was arguing or debating on the stage. Stanton, you're missed. So there's where I draw the line on Stanton Friedman. I could tell so many stories, but that's enough there because we have something else that I've been asked to present here tonight, which is some time on the Shag Harbour Incident. And this is going to be a short version. I could go on for days. This is going to be like the Coles Notes, or maybe even the pamphlet of Shag Harbour, but still, you can get more information. I'll leave you with there's all kinds of places you get other information. So my reinvestigation of the Shag Harbour Incident began, as I stated, around the time I found Stanton. It would begin. So if you do the math, there's a little error I think I've seen in the invitation that came to me, that I've been at this for 40 years, but it'll be 30 years next April. So somebody goofed up the arithmetic there. I suppose if it was 40 years, it sometimes feels like 100 years. I'd be 10 years farther along with it, But anyway, yes, and Shag Harbour, I guess, started for the similar reason in the beginning, that Unsolved Mysteries episode, which led me to Stanton, and with his help and his encouragement, next thing you know, I was in the thick of it. So the first step and the first sort of real period of Shag Harbour opening up to me, God, it was all happening at once in a way. When you see the documentaries and when you see it, even when they're accurate, they're a little misleading because I was such a busy fellow in the 90s and it was all kind of exploding at once at first. With Stanton's suggestions, I can remember going to the library and getting a pad of access to information forms and all the different places I sent them off and waited for the answers. And it was very heady times when you'd get these thick envelopes back, and I was finding all these great sources of documents. But the other thing that happened, I was completely unprepared for. I remember when I watched Unsolved Mysteries and saw the work and the work of others too, had put into the Roswell incident, I realized that I was hoping to learn from what mistakes were made there and avoid all that. I didn't want 3 different crash sites, and I didn't want people coming in saying, no, it didn't happen here, it happened there, and here's what really happened, and this guy didn't work there anyway. All these kind of things. I thought we're going to have a nice, neat thing. We're going to stick to the facts. Everything's going to be documented and backed up. One of the things I was lucky enough to know, I think I mentioned earlier with Stanton, that I had a friend whose dad was a trainer of the Granby divers. And of course, I remembered from my recollections of Shag Harbour, from my grandfather's who was there when it happened. I was 12 years old and living in Dartmouth, but he was down there and was one of many non-reporting witnesses who was in the area. He used to go there every year for his vacation from the Dartmouth Marine slips. And I contacted this friend's father, and he put me in line with the whereabouts of all the retired fleet diving members that had dove on the incident. And then on Shelburne, he says, you know about Shelburne? I said, no, I'm not talking about Shelburne. I said, Shag Harbour. Well, he said, you know, the real story is at Shelburne. Now, this is right in early days, just days after discovering the real date and talking to Stanton. And I was completely unprepared for this. And when I did find and interview the divers, they told me this amazing story that, yeah, a flying saucer had crashed into Shag Harbour. We all knew that. By the time we got down there, we knew it was no longer there. It had moved under the water up the coast and came to rest on the seabed halfway between Government Point near the Shelburne base, which was Canada's most secret base at the time. It was a US base on Canadian soil, and it was the coordination center for submarine detection. It was hard linked with Argentia, Newfoundland, and Key West, Florida. And it ran both what was known as the SOSA system, which was a sound system that microphoned the whole Atlantic Ocean, and it also the MAD grid, which stood for magnetic anomaly detection. This was to track Soviet subs. You have to remember, this is the height of the Cold War. Not only that, you know, it's easy to forget now we have a 200-mile international limit. Back in the day, we had a 12-mile limit. You could see Russian ships off the coast. And I'll give you one little idea how close they came. They actually came ashore at one point through this incident. Well, anyway, when I found the divers, they told me this, and I was unprepared for this. I didn't know what to think of it. A little while later, when I began working with my co-author on my first, the US published book, Dark Object with Don Ledger, Don was very excited about this, and he was like, well, Chris, this is the meat and potatoes of the case. But, you know, I felt quite the opposite. To me, this is what I was hoping to avoid, because the more information we found about Shag Harbour, there was no doubt about what happened there. And let me tell you what did happen there that night, quite simply, for anyone who has, if you have some people here that have not seen any of the treatments of it. On the night of October the 4th, 67, people who were out around 11:20 p.m., the moon had set. It was dark. You're in a fishing village. There was no street lights along Highway 3. People that rode in their cars or were insomniacs that rode would have seen a set of flashing lights in the sky that first flew in an easterly direction. And they flashed in an unusual pattern that was unlike commercial traffic. They went like 1, 2, 3, 4 in sequence, and then would flash all at once. And all the witnesses in the Shag Harbour area agree upon this. This continued. After several minutes, this object tilted to a 45-degree angle, descended rapidly to the water surface and struck, and produced the sound of an explosion, some say who were near, and a bright flash. Several people called the RCMP in nearby Barrington Passage, and they responded to the scene. Interestingly enough, those 7 calls, you know, in the days before the internet, during that so-called golden age UFOs, most investigators would say for every person who reported, because remember, the only way you could do that in those days would be to call the Rescue Coordination Center or to call RCMP or city police. You had to be pretty sure of what you're saying, and because your name was to it. The 3 officers who responded to this, one of them was out on highway patrol, and he saw it in the air. And when all 3 arrived at the scene by what the locals called the moss plant, it was a plant for processing Irish moss, which was used as a product to thicken ice cream and that come out of the sea. And they also processed some groundfish there at the time. When they got there, this thing was still floating upon the water, at least a pale yellow light. It didn't look like it did in the sky. But one of the officers, Constable Ron Pond, who appeared on camera in the 4 sightings episodes I did in the 90s, you know, they flew him down from up north. You know, he has stood by this story. Anyway, the Mounties attempted to reach the light, and it either extinguished or submerged, depending on whose account you go by, and before they could reach the last known surface position. What they did find was a streaky yellow foam, half a mile long and 80 feet in length. The Coast Guard was contacted, and they sent a ship from nearby Clark's Harbor. One of the most unique things about the Shag Harbour incident is all those people in Shag Harbour who reported, nobody reported a UFO. Everyone called and said, we think a plane's crashed. We've seen lights go into the water. But as time went by, there were no missing and no late aircraft. So what was it? Well, they began a search, and the reports went up through from local RCMP to headquarters in Ottawa. They went to the Rescue Coordination Center. They got passed up the pipe to Canadian Forces headquarters in Ottawa. The next day, they got clearance at the Air Desk, Canada's equivalent of Blue Book, that investigated UFOs for the Royal Canadian Air Force. And they ordered an underwater search through Maritime Command. The search went on. Like I said, it was October the 4th, 67. This was a Wednesday at 11:20. The underwater search would continue until Sunday at last light around 9 p.m. And the next day, the search was canceled. And they announced that they couldn't find anything. There was no missing aircraft. We don't know what it was. But everybody was so certain something had gone in. Over time, it slipped into the dustbin of history. There were a few follow-up articles in magazines like the Atlantic Advocate, retreatments in the newspaper. But the story had gone out around the world, because before the internet, the way that used to happen is the way it happened in this incident, which is that the headline story in the Halifax Herald that weekend was, could be something concrete in Shag Harbour UFO crash, RCAF. Well, that line story in Canada is what was often called Canada's most conservative broadsheet, not the kind of UFO story you usually see headlining the Herald, went out and around the world. Of course, you know, in my book, that's a complete chapter in itself. It's quite interesting how that story, you know, came to the front, because most of the staff are totally uncomfortable with it. It's a really huge story. There's a lot of the. Anyway, after the search was canceled, you know, it really wasn't over, the search, the public aspect of it. And when I talked about the thing getting away and resting on the seabed off of Shelburne, the public never knew about that. Everybody had agreed there was no missing aircraft. By all accounts, this thing was at least 60 feet in diameter and had 4 flashing lights. We now know that the lightkeeper on the island, his wife was up and knitting in the living room and looking out the window. And this lighthouse was stationed on Bon Partage Island. She was looking out the window toward the mainland, and she saw the UFO coming in, and she thought, oh my God, a plane's going to crash. Like everybody else, she could just see the lights, but she was actually staring out the window. All the other people that reported, like Lori Wickens and Dave Kendricks, local people, they lost sight of it behind the tree line driving their cars. But Isabel Banks, as her name was then, the lightkeeper's wife, looked out the window. She saw the moment of impact when it hit the water. I looked for years to find this lady, and she was up in New Brunswick, and unfortunately her second husband died and returned, but it allowed me to find her and sit down. But I guess when it hit the water, as the lights touched the surface of the water and the water began rushing up over the craft, it caused the lighting to reflect back on itself. And she could see that this thing was round and had no fuselage or whatever. So in essence, it was flying saucer. And when she first relayed the details to me in a face-to-face meeting in Barrington, Nova Scotia, I can remember, you know, just feeling good and hitting the table and saying, thank God we're not going to have to redraw the comic books. Because up to that point, everybody was so certain something had entered the water. Nobody had seen the moment of impact, right? Anyway, I have to cut this short soon, so I'm going to just tell you a couple things that are key about this. The great thing about Shag Harbour is that as time goes on, every time you find a new source of information, it doesn't evaporate. It doesn't get explained or explained away. For example, and by the way, with the help of Stanton Friedman, and that's well documented in the group, we found the pilots of a flight that went over that night, Pan Am 160. It was a cargo flight that used to fly weekly from JFK to Heathrow. And it was coming in over the Gulf of Maine, and it had a near collision with at least a very similar UFO over the Gulf of Maine. For 5 minutes, this thing dropped down from higher up in front of the nose of the craft, and they were slowly gaining on it. And the crew became very apprehensive. Unfortunately, by the time I heard about it, the captain was deceased, but the co-pilot and the flight engineer were still alive. And the co-pilot actually came to Nova Scotia, and he presented at one of the conferences we had when Stanton was there, and gave all his details. I have written statements giving all the details from both these men who were brave enough to, I mind you, they were retired then. They wanted to report at the time, and it was great. But anyway, as this thing was in front of them and they were gaining on it, the junior officer, the flight engineer, he kept saying, Kurt, he said, we got to do something. And he went up to the windscreen and cupped his hands against it. And his interpretation was that these lights he's seen on it were not external. They were actually internal, and he was looking into the craft. And those are the words of, and I have the written statement from Michael Littlepage. So, yeah. But every time something new comes up, and I forget what year it was, I think it was 2007, we linked up with them. And that was also of help of Stanton Friedman. But whether it was that, the statement of Isabel Banks, now Isabel Towers, these pilots, every kind of thing we've found since, the Shag Harbour incident becomes firmer and firmer, its interpretation as maybe not a crash, but at least a controlled ditch into the water of a UFO, certainly nothing conventional. And unfortunately, the Shelburne story has been the bane of my existence. We have tried hard. A few years back, I accessed all the logbooks for ships in the Canadian Navy that had been stationed through that period on the East Coast and beyond, and some US ships with the help of people in the US. And none of it ever quite come together. There's a little bit of funny business in some of them, but you name a Canadian ship at that time when supposedly there were several in this operation sitting over a UFO for a week, and we cannot name those ships. The divers there, I'm not saying I don't believe the story, they aren't lying. That hard evidence has yet to come forward. There was secondary evidence in terms of RCMP files that suggest there was a second search there. But the names of these ships are lacking in the details. You name a ship like HMCS Chaudière. Well, it was on its way to Florida and not there. I can locate them all. Fraser, it was in Washington doing, Bonaventure was on refit up in Montreal. I went right through the whole Navy and logbooks. But the search continues. And although the Shelburne story remains a story, it may not always be such. What Shag Harbour is, it's beyond reproach. Something unconventional crashed there. Too many witnesses, including 3 RCMP officers. And I'll wrap it up about Shag Harbour and wait for questions and answers. Hopefully there'll be a few. In that it remains the world's only UFO crash scenario that's supported in that interpretation by government documents that are freely available and are entirely without controversy as to their origin or their authenticity. And the thing is, there are 4 primary sources of documents. There's National Archives, now known as Library and Archives Canada. There's the Directorate of History at DND headquarters, St. Mary's University in Halifax, and an APRO report that was found amongst the files of John Brent Musgrave and was definitely written at the request of Jim Lorenzen by a local investigator in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia at the time, who was William F. Dawson, who wrote a bunch of articles about it and believed that it was a UFO event. And at the time, he was head of the Royal Astronomical Society. Anyway, thanks for your interest. Thanks for the invitation. And I'll take any questions if you have any. And I hope I might have a few answers.
Wow. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Really fascinating details about Stanton, of course. And I'm going to start with the first one, I believe was by Evelyn. Is the exposition being held in Shag Harbour this year or next? And I think somebody wrote down 2nd of October, but I'm not sure if it's 2022 or 2021.
Well, okay. In terms of there's a website for the Shag Harbour UFO Expo. The big event with the American presenters, people like Nick Pope, Debbie Ziegelmeyer, Rob Switek, etc. That is scheduled for October of 2022. And all the details about that are online at that site. And you just simply have to type in Shag Harbour UFO Expo. There will be a local event here that's a limited affair That's just going to be a sort of tour to the crash site and the site of other UFO events, to the gates of the bases, to where me and other locals had a 2018 sighting, of which there was video, a sighting that lasted an hour and 20 minutes in the daytime on Cape Civil Island. And yeah, but that's a local event, nothing, you know, terribly special. What's interesting about the UFO Expo, saying hopefully next year, if COVID allows, you know, we had to delay it, unfortunately, is that it's probably the only kind of conference where you can go, you can meet the actual witnesses that were there, people like Lori Wickens, you know, that were there back in '67, Dave Kendricks, others that'll be present. You can meet the so-called experts, which might include myself about it. I mean, there are really no experts in this field, to be honest. But, you know, I've done the work, got out of the armchair, and have assembled what we do know about. But so you can meet the people that were there. We can take you right to where it happened. And we're going to do that on the Sunday on a bus. We're going to go right there. So you're going to meet the people, you know, what people like I think and the experts. You're going to meet the people that actually can witness it in their first words. We're going to take you right to where it happened, you know. And, you know, actually a couple of years ago, we did that with some people from the Canadian Mint. And that night, didn't they have a UFO sighting? The two people were down for the release of the coin. Yeah, they still work there. I'm not going to release their names or whatever, but oh, that was a wild night, I'll tell you.
Talk about serendipity there.
Yeah.
Both Melinda and Evelyn have asked, did the submarine monitoring base in Shelburne get involved in any way, and the Air Force Base at Baccaro? And I do know that myself included, people have mixed and matched the events, that Shag Harbour and Shelburne are two different events on two different dates, but people get the two of them confused as one.
Yeah. Even that is not 100% clear, but there's lots of indications that they were at the same time. There's an RCMP X file of a sighting, again, same day, October the 4th, '67, by a dragger 16 miles off the coast of Sambro, Nova Scotia, the Nickerson. It had 18 men on board, and they saw 4 UFOs in the distance, you know, above the water, and they had radar returns. And about 9 p.m., and this is like, you know, 2.5 hours before the Shag Harbour incident, one of these becomes airborne and arcs towards southwestern Nova Scotia. They contact the RCMP, and when they come back in from the fishing grounds on Saturday morning, they go into Lunenburg and they file a UFO report. And what's interesting is in the statement of the Captain Leo Howard Mersey, who I interviewed face to face before he passed, is that he went in and he's in the second last sentence of his statement, it says, perhaps like it's the thing they're looking for down off Barrington, which would be Shag Harbour. That's all the, you know, the same area of Woods Harbour, Shag Harbour, Barrington Passage blends into each other. He says, perhaps it's like the thing they're looking for down off that or off Shelburne. And the reason he knew, because even though Shag Harbour was a headline story and had gone around the world through the media and the ripples of that had moved out, nobody knew about Shelburne. He only knew about it because he had a warning from the harbor pilot that there was a naval operation out there and not to go near it.
Interesting.
Now,
did you find anything when you did your diving mission in 1995, again from Melinda?
No, when we dove in 95, there were 4 days of diving. This was part of episodes of the program Sightings, a Paramount television production, used to broadcast on Fox. And I did 4 episodes of that. The search we did was all in what's known as the Sound for the first 3 days. For 1 day, we went out and attempted to dive on what's called the Shag Harbour Rip, where a ship from BIO in 1988 thought they found very unusual circles on the bottom there. That was a feature. We never did get to go on the rip dive, but in the Sound, this is where the initial impact was, and you know, in a grid area around it, we went everywhere. We found nothing unusual, no bottom trauma, no artifacts, no whatever. You know, the water's actually pretty shallow there. When you fly over it, like in a light plane at low altitude, you can see right to the bottom there. So if there had been anything, but I think what's interesting is when the original naval search was done, it involved 7 divers from the Fleet Diving Unit. They dove in pairs. This was a low-tech affair. These were men with flashlights, going down, laying a grid pattern. They found nothing at the time. And I think it's very interesting that where everyone agrees that an object estimated usually at 60 feet, although some estimates I found since were double that, had been seen to be flying and crash into the water there. It would have been very easy to find that or some sizable wreckage or whatever, and nothing was found. So where people are so certain, and like I say, even one of the constables, Ron Pond, saw it both in the air and on the water. You have to ask, what was it that was there? We had nothing that was aerodynamic and hydrodynamic then, and we don't today. Would have been pretty useful in Vietnam back at the time,
Again, a question I think still from Linda here. Did you check local historical society sources like the Cape Sable Historical Society or Archaeolus Smith?
We checked with the Chapel Hill Historical Society, which seems to be the largest and most active one there in the area. I found all the original reporting witnesses. Some of them have never been interviewed or would cooperate. Most of them did. Some of them are well-known names now, like Laurie Wickens, and who was the first one to call the RCMP. It's interesting because the sighting came from many different areas simultaneous. And one of the unique things about this case is that no one reported a UFO. It's the authorities that start labeling that as they go back for secondary interviews. When they go back to see the witnesses again, they go, that thing you reported the other day, that was no aircraft, that was whatever. They start referring to it as a UFO. And when you look at all the documents, I named some of those sources. We have many of the telexes that went between the bases at the time. Telex was the primary form of communication. And they're very telling. And I'll tell you what they tell very strongly that we would not have known without them is they show you what the various armed forces and the government thought of the incident, how serious they took it. And when you see these orders that went between the bases, often what's most telling is not the body of text, but the margin notes written in by staffers. You'll see and I've learned to eventually identify all the handwriting. There wasn't that many staffers at the air desk, right? And I'd see something and I know it was Squadron Leader William Bain or something, whose name was identified in, the headline story in the Herald about Shag Harbour when it came out October the 7th. But, you'd see this text and, you'd see them write, send to Mr. Greenwood at the Defense Research Board. Could this have been? And they'll scratch this all out and at the top, UFO in big letters, underlined 3 times and an exclamation mark. Well, I've looked at a lot of these and I've never seen anything quite that strong, right? So that too is very telling. Some people have asked, well, where's the Manning report on this? There's all kinds of military telexes. There's memos that went around. And there's a great memo, 36 hours after the incident begins, that goes and is signed off on by people in the Defense Department. And in the 3rd paragraph, it says, a preliminary investigation has been carried out by the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax. And it has been determined that this sighting was not caused by a flare, float, aircraft, or in fact, any known object. And it describes it as being 60 feet in diameter, right in this report. This is 36 hours later. And it's all signed off on by everybody, that's at the air desk and above them, so.
Chris, I have to, because of my previous job, what I'm aware of is that we were under surveillance, almost under assault by the Soviets at that time, now the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
They actually came in close to every harbor or port on the coast, and they planted listening devices and sensors to pick up all of our naval vessels and any cargoes, if you name it, coming or entering. We tracked these things down. Some of them are unusual. They were removed and replaced again with our own sets of systems. But it was a constant ongoing game. So they would not have dismissed these reports of something going into the water that might have been something not from here.
Well-
They would have examined it in detail. This comes to Cecilia's question. Do you think the government found anything in their search that they did not disclose to the public?
I think the American government did. And I can tell you why. First of all, before I forget, when you talk about them planting devices, I've seen one of them. And they wrap it up in net and dead fish and everything. They disguise it. It was real cool, you know? And they actually did a little stunt in Shag Harbour where there was a large ship, a factory fishing ship, but it was one of these ones had more radar gear than fishing gear on it, used to see in the Cold War.
No seagulls.
Yeah, it was called the TUR, the TUR. And while the Shag Harbour incident is playing out in those following days, apparently a crew member needed an emergency appendix operation, and he was brought ashore into the Yarmouth Hospital. The captain and the commissar came ashore. This is all in the Yarmouth paper, right? With them. They lost track of them, and they were arrested up near the Shelburne base and just sent back to the ship, right? So they were trying to get close to figure what was going on for sure. Anyway, the question about, do you think they found something? I believe the Americans may have found something, and here's why. Based on a couple things. In 1994, I went to Ottawa and I interviewed Squadron Leader William Bain face to face. He was one of the two majors at the air desk that ran the RCAF's department at the time that investigated UFOs, right? And I showed him all the evidence I had at that point, and oh, he was a fascinating guy. And he spoke of his own sightings, even he'd hand off the coast by flying S2 sub-trackers out of Shearwater, you know, and typically they would be 100 miles or so off Shelburne and see at first what he thought was just tricks of light, but he figured they were some type of UFO, you know, something beyond our technology. He was quite open about that to me. We talked about many things. We talked about other cases like the Falcon Lake case, which he believed was genuine. I was surprised by that because I know they took a dim view of it at the Condon Committee. He was very forthcoming to me. When I showed him all the evidence I had and I told him about the Shelburne story, I said, look, there appears to be no doubt of what happened in Shag Harbour. But the Shelburne story has eluded me, and I kept showing him how I could not find the hard evidence to back up the story, but why it seemed so believable. And he looked at me and he said, I can see why you think the evidence is there, that you can't abandon it. He said, besides, as you know, you can't pick and choose your data. You know, it's there. You know, why would these men lie? And I said, I agree, but I can't find the proof. And he said to me, you know, we might have been stick-handled by the Americans. And I said, why do you say that? And he gave some great examples of it. But, you know, in other cases, interestingly enough, only a few years ago, somebody was trudging around on Bon Portage Island. This is the island again with the manned lighthouse in the day where the wife saw the, and in amongst the kelp and the seaweed and that on some rocks, they found a gold medallion, but it's actually a U.S. Navy geodesic marker, right? And it had a weird code on it. So when you find them, there's usually two more. We've yet to find the rest, but it was very clearly marked as a U.S. geodesic marker on the island, right? And when I looked up the code, there was a bunch of them, and this code said it's something that was marked to mark the location of an object of extreme interest that had been discovered. Now, why in the island there on the land? Well, the thing is, later that night, after the initial Shag Harbour incident reported in the papers, some local residents, including a fellow on Bear Point Road, he was like myself, 12 at the time, woke up when he seen lights outside his house and searchlights going, and heard helicopters pass. But then a little later, he heard a whistling object come over the house, and it sounded like something that was tumbling that just missed his house. And he figured it was going at such an angle. He ran, looked out the window. He couldn't see it, but he figured he told me at the time it probably hit Bon Portage Island. And it was a few years later we found this marker there. So the other thing is that the local lightkeeper, when I first interviewed him in '93, he's the only person to ever change his testimony regarding the Shag Harbour incident. Told me he found nothing. You know, they woke him up, he searched, he got up the next day and saw nothing. Well, in 2001, with the release of Don Ledger and I's first book, Dark Object. He showed up at the release of that, and we had a huge turnout at Evelyn Richardson School. I remember the gym was just packed. And I can remember the organizer of this says he's never been before, because they'd had events before, the local fishermen and that, used to come out and testify. Don and I were up there doing a book signing and handing out books. And when the locals come up, they told their usual story. And when this guy come up, I didn't know what he was going to tell, because in the past, when I attempted to interview him, he always said they found nothing. So he started saying that, as he told me at first, that when they first called him and woke him up, by the way, the first person trying to wake him up was his wife, but he wouldn't get up till the Coast Guard called. That's another story. He was supposed to be up and on duty, but anyway. Eventually Irving got up, he went out and he did a foot patrol and looked around and found nothing that night. But then he started claiming that the next morning at first light, when they sent him out and he went around to look, that he found the strange cylinder that had wires and tubing hanging out and had a very terrible smell to it and all this. And he came in and they told him how to pack it up and ship it away. Well, I remember sitting 3/4 of the way back in the audience, right behind Don Ledger and his wife. And I leaned over to Don, I said, have you heard just about enough of this? I'd never heard anybody ever change their testimony. We haven't had anyone do it since or before. So I stood up, and then my chair kind of scraped and everybody turned and looked at me. And before I could say a word, Irvin Banks, before the whole community, and let's say there was over 200 people there that night in that gym, he said, I know what you're going to say, and that's fair, because I held this from you. And I said, Irving, if you lied to me then, why should anybody here believe you now? And he said, that's fair. I said, I'm going to sit down and let you finish. I said, but when you're done, I'm going to have questions down the back of the room. They're not going to be easy. And I let him finish and didn't want to interrupt him any further. Well, he told me, as often is the case from such people, he had a pension and he was worried about this, and they'd sworn a secrecy oath and, all the usual things. And he did make some effort over the years after that to try to help me to find the lighthouse records, which have never been found, and did several other things that would back up his story. Unfortunately, he has since passed, and he didn't seem to want to leave me to his ex-wife, which I can understand, who had remarried and was living in New Brunswick. But when I found her, but even before that, when I heard the story of Peter Gorham, a local, who told me about the thing coming to the island, which could account for discovering the next morning, the object, and other little pieces of evidence, I would have loved to have told him, but I never had that chance, But that Navy finder, why were they going ashore on that island? Why would they leave America there? So they might have found something. It might have been an artifact. It could have been, it may not have been from the object. It may not have been something unusual, but it may have contained important data. It might have been a sonar buoy that didn't make it into the water they dropped. I don't know. But why would the U.S. Navy there go ashore? What we do know is there were U.S. ships in the area. We also know that aircraft that were flying and dropping sonar buoys in the days after the incident were going into each other's territory without clearance. And all the pilots and E-Link officers told me they'd never experienced that before. They've been given just a general clearance and they could fly into U.S. airspace and back and vice versa. And it was quite unusual. So maybe Squadron Leader Bain was right. Maybe Bill Bain knew, like he said. He looked at me and said, it wouldn't be the first time, but we've been stick handled by the Americans. And
I'd say that's a fair call, but coming over to Tabitha's question that may be
Sure.
related, she's curious what you know about ruling out terrorist or human visitors that may have gone under our radar, people trying to pull something illegal out there. I do know that if you were trying to grab the lobster in an area that wasn't yours, there'd be guns coming out. So I have a feeling that it was much more closely watched than people know.
Yeah, I see what happened to some of the divers that used to go down and try to grab lobster in Halifax Harbor up by Dams Island. I remember that. Yeah, that wasn't such a thing back in the day. Yeah, I don't know what terrorists would have to account for an object that was, again, like aerodynamic and hydrodynamic,
Aside from our visitors from out there, the Soviets would be the ones with the most interest, the Americans with countering it. Question from Cecilia. Whereabouts was the Shelburne incident cited? She's currently there on vacation, would like to check it out before she leaves.
Okay.
And her second question was, have you had any encounters with men in black or other strange experiences since you began your research on Shag Harbour?
Okay. I remember the first time that question came up in the US. It was funny. Let me deal with the first one, Shelburne. The Shelburne base is the buildings. The base closed in '95, although I was in it when it was still an active base. You know, it was shut down in '95, and we started having our own system, which is Maryland Center in Halifax on the waterfront. The Shelburne base, like I said, you know, when it first opened, it was a US only base on Canadian soil. And after '62, it was a 50-50 deal, like in NORAD. You know, in 1 year, you'd have a US commander. Anyway, the location, it's on Sandy Point Road, which leads out of Shelburne. It's probably about 10 miles out that road. And it's very obvious. It's at a place, if you look on the map, called Government Point. And, you know, you'll see all the old buildings there. For some years afterwards, after the base closed, it was sold and used as a soundstage. And at the time when the Nova Scotia government was pumping a lot of money into tax credits for film production, there used to be, you know, in its best year, I think 51 Hollywood productions were done there, you know. But nowadays, I don't know what they're doing there. The buildings still exist, you know. We take people to the gates of it. I warn you, if you go there in summer, watch out for ticks. The long grass there is just filled with deer ticks. You have to check yourself when you come out. You might want to stay on the gravel pathways. But yeah, the buildings that were part of the base were still there. Anyway, that's where it is, you know, on Sandy Point Road. And
Men in Black?
What was your other question there?
Have you come across any Men in Black?
Oh, Men in Black. No. I as I said in the state, I'll never forget this. The first time I did a lecture in the States was in Greensboro, North Carolina. And that was when I met Phil Klass the first time. Didn't go to lunch that time. That was funny.
Just a second. For those who don't know, Phil Klass really wanted the world to know that Stanton was a complete fraud, was out to make money off of poor people who didn't know what they were looking at or listening to. And he was trying to make his living off of debunking Stanton. And Stanton called him out big time. One quick example there. Klass said that Stanton couldn't prove that there was any documentation using the kinds of typewriters they used to tell these reports to the President of the United States. And he told Stanton, if you can prove this, I'll give you $100 for each one. Stanton found 14 or more, and he paid them a check of $1,000, which is probably why he continued to hate him and debunk him big time. So interesting to hear what you have to say about Phil.
About Phil? Well,
about Klass.
Klass. Well, after that, get that. You'll love this then. He tried to report Stanton for drawing unemployment insurance, which was his right. He'd had a contract job that ended. And of course, if he earned money from a lecture, like anybody collecting, you simply record the income. But he'd worked as an employee for a time. He'd done many contracts. I mean, Stanton designed some of the shielding for the reactor on the Pioneer space probe for NASA. He did PR work for Point Lepreau. You know, he did all kinds of different things as an applied nuclear physicist. And as you know, as was pointed out last week by Kathleen, you know, he wasn't a PhD, and he always would correct somebody. I was a little horrified to see a show on there, a recent episode of Ancient
Aliens.
What is it? Aliens. That's it. Ancient Aliens. God. And on that, you know, there was an episode. It wasn't a bad episode, actually, that was about, you know, some of the greats in the field that had gone before, whether it was, you know, the Lorenzens, Jim McDonald, and Stanton, of course, since he's passed, was included in that. And they kept calling him Dr. Friedman. And, you know, he would always kind of, no, you don't have to call me doc. I'm not a PhD. He would always straighten it out. Somebody on that show you would have thought would have done the research to know that. And I think some of the guests that were commenting would have corrected them, but they didn't. Anyway, yeah, Phil Klass, you're going to love this. The first time I met Phil Klass, of course, I thought, oh my God, he's there. And of course, I should have known that he'd show up at, you know, a MUPON conference. And I remember being slightly nervous. I'm not nervous in terms of being in front of people, or, you know, I used to play music and be in bands, you know, and roll around the stage with a Stratocaster, you know, like not shy. But I remember going down there. I wasn't worried, but I thought, and this was early on. There hadn't been much on television yet or anything. I thought, are the Americans going to want to hear this Canadian story? I didn't know how it would be received. And I did my first presentation. I can remember the first speaker was Kevin Randall, and they booed him. This is at a MUFON conference. And the reason being, he'd said some negative things. I wouldn't say attack about Betty Hill. And the claws come out in the audience. Not everybody, but 50% of the audience, you could hear the boos, right? And I remember thinking, ooh, tough audience, right? Out front of the audience, right in the front row with his little handheld tape recorder held out cassette, was Phil Klass. While Randall was giving his presentation, Phil fell asleep, keeled over in the seat, and the recorder was on the floor. So I was the next presenter. And I went up to present, and he was down there. Well, I kept Phil awake anyway. He didn't fall asleep. And when I was done, it was well received. There was a lot of applause. And the first person to come up on stage actually was Kevin Randall. And he says, I'm writing the next book here, the first chapter. Give me a call. Here's my hotel room. He handed me a card, and away he went. And the second person to come up was Phil Klass. And he come up to me, and he was nodding, and he said, I want to shake your hand. He said, I want to get my picture taken with you. He says, I guess we can retire now because you Canadian guys have solved it all. And I'm like, yeah, so that's enough of a belly rub, for him. He says, no, he says, I remember that incident. Something happened there. And I thought, what's the catch line here? I was really, no, he says, I'll have a look into that. He says, I'll probably put something on my website or write an article. He says, don't let that worry you. No, he says, Chris, something did happen there. You did an amazing job. And was very gracious with me, right?
Wow.
He never did put an article on the website or write anything about it because, I don't think he could dismiss it. And that was it. I ran into class several other times. I remember once having to have supper with him and a couple other skeptics in Trenton, New Jersey years later. And it was a hoot. And that was where he left me with the quote where I'd asked Kathleen about the other week, where he said, I'm going to make a prediction, Chris. He said, don't get too close to that guy. And he says, I'll tell you this, he says, that when I leave this planet and when Stanton Friedman's gone, he goes, we won't be any closer to solving this mystery because there is none. Thank you, Phil. Good night. And he needed help to get to his bedroom too that night. So,
Okay, well, Chris, I do have one last question
Sure.
from Evelyn in this case. Could
Yeah.
the reason few identified that object at Shag Harbour as a UFO in the area is that there was not a lot of knowledge about UFOs at the time? They didn't know what it was and couldn't think of it being anything other than something man-made.
well, the people that reported it, that called it in, right? Let's just say 11:20 at night in a fishing village in 67 with no streetlights. UFOs were the last thing on your mind. Their concerns were for the possibility of survivors.
Yes.
And I can tell you something, this was a very emotional thing because they simply called and said, you guys better get the Mounties here quick. Like, lights had gone into the water, or we think a plane's gone down. Get there now. And everybody raced to the water, and local boats started to head out, right? Because they were fearful about the possibility of survivors. And I know what that feeling's like is.
Crash. Yes.
Yeah, I remember off Peggy's Cove when Swiss Air 111 went down.
Yes.
And the survivor regret and the feelings of people. Well, those boats that initially went out that night, people told me they felt sick to their stomach, had no, because they didn't know what to expect, what was coming up, and that's how these things are when you do it. And of course, living like that and being, in such a community, you're used to tragedy and this sort of thing, and you feel good. But, there was every kind of reaction in between. In fact, the very first witness that called in would have been Laurie Wickens, right? Perhaps the person that saw it best and knew it had actually impacted was the lightkeeper's wife. But the first person to call the RCMP was Laurie Wickens. And at, a young guy of 18, he already had a local reputation. When he called the detachment, Corporal Victor Werbicki answered, and he said, you guys, he goes, we think a plane's gone down the town. You better get there. We're headed up the road right now. And he said, okay, we'll look into it. And he goes, Laurie, what you been drinking? And he said, yeah, okay, we'll look into it. And he hung up the phone. And the girls that were in the car with him said, Laurie, are the Mounties coming? Everybody was excited. And he said, I don't think they believe me. He was about to leave. And then the payphone rang again. The Mounties called back. They said, "You still there, Rickens? We're on the way." They'd already had 6 other calls from different, So it was like that. It ran the full gambit of human response. But by the time people were getting in boats and heading out to the last known surface position, people were starting to feel nauseous in the stomach. They were afraid of what they'd saw.
Yeah.
They'd gone out and found colleagues, that had
Yeah.
succumbed to tragedy. It's part of their life there.
Life of the fishing community.
Yes,
They're not strangers to death and
not at all.
disaster.
It's something they live with.
But they're the kind of people who they responded as quickly as they could to what they saw. And that's the nature of all of it. Everybody's curious. This didn't happen by accident. People saw what they saw. They may not have known what it was, but it got reported, it got recorded and documented. Chris, I want to say thank you so very much for your presentation. I think I'm going to bring this to the end. And basically, thank you so very much. As I say, you come up with an awful lot of things I'd not heard before, particularly about the lights.
You'll have to read the book.
Yes,
I'll
we
send you a
will.
book here. I'll give you one.
Okay, we'll read it. I'll share it with everybody at the museum.
Okay.
So thank you to everyone for coming tonight, and especially thanks to Chris for making the 3rd presentation of the Stanton Friedman Memorial Speaker Series. I want to remind everyone that the next presentation of the series will be on Thursday, 29th of July with Jennifer Stein. Now, she's an American documentary film producer who worked closely with Stanton on the famous Travis Walton abduction case. Jennifer produced the award-winning documentary Travis, which includes commentary from Stanton himself. Hope to see you again next week. If you have any questions, you can always contact us at the Fredericton Region Museum by email. We'll flash that up. But again, check out the Fredericton Region Museum website. Thank you so very much for joining us, everyone, and I hope to see you next week. Night.
Dark star in the night, glowing, moving into sight. Engines pulsing as you land. Bright star gonna make a stand.